the shimmering world of Hollywood, where secrets are currency and stars burn brightly, only to flicker out in whispers and shadows, the story of Delilah Hart and Victor Devereaux would etch itself into a grim chapter of Tinseltown's dark history. It wasn't simply a scandal. It was the kind of tale that would haunt sound stages and backlots long after the names faded from the marquee. Delilah Hart was Hollywood's darling, a striking actress with alabaster skin, wild red hair, and a presence that could freeze an audience. Rising from a humble, unassuming life, she was now everywhere, plastered on magazine covers, draped in designer gowns, and endlessly chased by paparazzi. Her every move was documented, every smile analyzed, but there was one truth about her that she kept hidden from all but the most trusted circle: her affair with Victor Devereaux, one of Hollywood's most powerful directors. Victor Devereaux was a legend, enigmatic, sharp, and reputed to be dangerously charming. Known for his visionary, dark films that drew award after award, he was as much a mystery to Hollywood as Delilah was an open book. Rumors of his personal life were frequent, but the stories always pointed in different directions, leaving his true self tantalizingly obscured. What few knew, however, was that Victor and Delilah's paths had crossed years before her career truly took off. She was young, naive, and entranced by his brooding charisma. He was enchanted by her beauty and her ambition. Their affair began under the dim glow of studio lights, stolen moments behind set walls, the quiet corners of upscale Hollywood hotels. It was torrid and all-consuming, a blend of passion and creative energy that left them both feeling invincible. But what had begun as passion soon soured into something darker. Victor was demanding, prone to jealousy and temper. He wanted Delilah entirely for himself. He pulled strings, ensured her roles, and pushed his influence to catapult her to stardom. And though she was grateful, Delilah was beginning to feel trapped under his control, like a puppet whose strings were tugged without mercy. Then came the news that shattered their fragile union. Delilah had fallen in love with a fellow actor, a bright-eyed, kind man who saw her not as a starlet, but as a woman with hopes and fears. She decided to end things with Victor, hoping to salvage her career without his looming presence. But breaking free from Victor was never going to be easy. One evening, as twilight cast long shadows across Beverly Hills, Delilah received an unexpected invitation to Victor's private estate. It was a sprawling mansion, half buried behind towering hedges and electric gates. She arrived hesitantly, knowing this confrontation would be final, that they'd end things quietly, peacefully, like adults. Victor met her at the door, his face drawn, a forced smile stretched thinly across his lips. He led her through dim hallways, lined with velvet and polished wood, into his personal study, a room she had been in countless times. The familiarity only made her heart beat faster. Victor poured them each a glass of wine, his gaze piercing as he handed her the glass. They spoke in calm, measured tones, Victor feigning understanding. But as Delilah continued, admitting her love for another man and her desire to leave, something changed in his eyes. He grew silent, his face shadowed as he listened. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked her to reconsider, to remember what they had. Delilah shook her head, standing to leave. She put the untouched glass of wine on his desk and turned her back to him, feeling the coldness of his stare between her shoulder blades. She had almost reached the door when she heard him step forward, his voice darker, tainted with an edge she had never heard before. "No one leaves me, Delilah." A cold shiver ran down her spine. She turned back to see him holding the empty wine glass, his fingers curling tightly around its stem. The glass was shaking in his grip, and before she could react, He smashed it against the desk, shards scattering everywhere. Grabbing one of the broken pieces, he moved towards her, his eyes wild, angered beyond reason. In the desperate struggle that followed, Delilah fought for her life, managing to fend him off momentarily and escape into the labyrinth of his mansion. She ran blindly, heart pounding, realizing too late that she was in a maze designed by him, with no chance of escape. Every room she entered seemed to lead her back to him, the walls echoing his deranged laughter. Hours later, the police arrived to find the mansion eerily quiet. The call had come from a neighbor who reported hearing what sounded like a scream and shattering glass. The police entered the study where Victor was sitting, his face scratched, blood seeping from cuts on his hands. He looked calm, eerily so, as he stared into the dying embers of the fireplace. Delilah's body was found in one of the rooms, a tragic broken form crumpled on the floor. In his statements, Victor claimed it had been an accident, that she had tripped while trying to escape his desperate attempts to win her back. He painted himself as a man devastated by heartbreak, cast aside by the woman he had made a star. But as the investigations continued, inconsistencies began to emerge. The shards of glass that littered the floor, the signs of a violent struggle, and the sinister scratches on his face, signs of Delilah's desperate last fight. Victor's trial captivated Hollywood, exposing the monstrous side of one of its most beloved figures. The courtroom was packed daily with press and public alike, both mesmerized and horrified. And though he continued to insist on his innocence, maintaining that Delilah's death had been an accident, the mounting evidence painted a darker picture. Victor was ultimately convicted, and though the court proceedings attempted to answer the question of what truly happened that night, the full truth was known only to the silent walls of his mansion. Delilah's memory would linger on, her star eclipsed in tragedy, and Victor's once celebrated name would forever be stained by the blood on his hands. In the end, Hollywood moved on, as it always does. But some say that on quiet nights, a woman's whisper echoes through the halls of Victor's mansion, chilling anyone who dares to listen. The whisper tells of a love that turned deadly, a tragic romance in a town that feasts on dreams and nightmares alike. Victor Devereaux's conviction rocked Hollywood, and his fall from grace was as spectacular as any of his films. But his fame, his dark charisma, and even his wealth couldn't save him from a life behind bars. The world thought that was the end of his story, that he would live out his days in a maximum security prison, haunted by the ghost of Delilah Hart. Yet, the truth was far from over. Months passed, and rumors began to seep from behind prison walls. Other inmates spoke in hushed tones about the notorious director, how he seemed unbothered, almost smug, even within the confines of his cell. Guards reported that he received constant letters, hand-delivered in unmarked envelopes, filled with promises of loyalty from a small, disturbing fan base who believed in his innocence and even admired him for his passion. A few of them began to organize under an anonymous online forum called the Devereaux Defense, hell-bent on proving his innocence. One day, Victor received a visit from an enigmatic lawyer, a young woman named Ivy Lane. Despite her age, she was known for her sharp mind and ruthlessness in court, a reputation Victor respected. Ivy had risen to prominence, representing controversial figures, the sort of clients other lawyers avoided. But Ivy had one rule. She only took cases she knew she could win, or at least manipulate into a compelling spectacle. She saw Victor's case as her ultimate opportunity to shift the public narrative and bring her career into the spotlight. Victor, sitting behind a thick wall of glass, looked at her with an amused smirk as she sat down, her piercing eyes meeting his with a flicker of intrigue. Ivy wasted no time in laying out her plan. "Victor," she said, "there are gaps in the evidence. I can work with those. There are witnesses we can discredit, loopholes we can exploit. Your story may not be perfect, but there's enough room for reasonable doubt. If we can't win an outright appeal, we may be able to shake up the public perception enough to force a new trial. But first, you have to trust me. Completely." Victor leaned back, considering her words, and nodded. His mind was already racing, concocting a strategy, not just for his legal battle, but for the bigger game he had in mind. He didn't want his freedom only for himself. He wanted vindication. He wanted his name back. The world had wronged him, he thought, and he was not about to let that go unanswered. Weeks turned into months, and Ivy wove her legal magic. Through Ivy's media connections, they released old footage of Delilah looking distressed on set, clips that painted her as increasingly unstable in the final weeks of her life. They cited anonymous sources who claimed Delilah had a hidden side, suggesting that her alleged affair might have been a figment of her imagination. The case was presented not as the tragic loss of an innocent starlet, but as the mental unraveling of a woman caught up in the pressures of stardom. Bit by bit, Ivy planted the seeds of doubt, her work meticulously designed to exploit the fickle, celebrity-obsessed culture of Hollywood. The media frenzy worked. Journalists began questioning Delilah's reputation, and online conspiracies about her supposed secret life grew. Public opinion, once so certain of Victor's guilt, began to shift, doubt creeping into the headlines. Finally, Ivy's persistence paid off. Victor was granted a new trial. When the day arrived, the courtroom was packed. Reporters huddled around, eager to capture every detail. The public was ravenous, drawn by morbid curiosity. But behind the spectacle, there was one face in the crowd who had waited far longer than the rest. Simon Thorne, Delilah's lover, and the man she had intended to start a new life with before her untimely death. Simon had avoided the limelight, mourning her loss quietly in the months since her death. But seeing Victor on the stand again, smugly addressing the court, brought a rage in Simon he'd barely kept suppressed. He knew in his bones that Victor was guilty. And now, seeing him inch closer to freedom, Simon realized that he couldn't just sit by. On the last day of the trial, Simon made his way up to the witness stand, his jaw set, eyes blazing with conviction. Ivy sneered as he took his seat, ready to tear him apart. But Simon had come prepared. He testified about Victor's possessive nature, painting a harrowing picture of Delilah's fear of Victor. He described how, in the weeks before her death, she had confided in him about her plan to leave Hollywood altogether, to escape the darkness that seemed to follow her every move. His testimony was damning, every word calculated, and as he spoke, a tense silence gripped the room. Victor's calm mask faltered for the first time, his eyes narrowing as Simon revealed these intimate details. But then, Ivy pulled out her ace. She questioned Simon's own relationship with Delilah, painting him as an obsessive, spurned lover, jealous of Victor's influence. "Isn't it true," Ivy pressed, "that you were the one who was desperate to see Victor out of the picture? That you were angry that Delilah was planning to leave you, not him?" Simon faltered, momentarily thrown off by the question, his gaze flashing with fury. Ivy's smear campaign had come full circle, and the courtroom erupted into whispers. She cast Simon's love for Delilah as possessive and questioned the integrity of his story. The jury's expressions shifted, their glances dark with uncertainty. Finally, in a dramatic twist, Victor himself was allowed to take the stand, his composed face full of quiet confidence. With his charm on full display, He portrayed himself as a misunderstood genius who had only ever loved Delilah and was now paying for a crime he didn't commit. He turned to Simon with a calculated smirk, making it clear that even if he lost in court, he would win in the court of public opinion. In the end, the jury remained deadlocked. The trial concluded without a clear verdict, leaving Victor neither free nor fully convicted. And yet, the stain on Delilah's memory was permanent. Public perception had been twisted beyond repair. Victor returned to his cell that night, satisfied. He had not won, but he had achieved a different kind of victory, a tainted triumph, yet one that left him as much a mystery to the world as ever. Meanwhile, Simon, devastated and helpless, vowed that he would not let Victor's poison linger. He began his own investigation, refusing to rest until he could prove what the court could not. Hollywood soon turned its gaze elsewhere, but Simon knew that Victor's secrets ran deeper, that Delilah deserved more than to be reduced to a scandal. And as he dug into Victor's past, he discovered threads that led to other women, past flames who had mysteriously disappeared or left Hollywood without a trace. The deeper he looked, the more Simon realized that Victor Devereaux had more skeletons in his closet than anyone had ever imagined. Simon Thorne's private investigation took him deep into the underbelly of Hollywood, where secrets lay buried under layers of glamour and deceit. For months, he sifted through archives, contacted past acquaintances of Victor, and tracked down people who had known Victor's previous lovers. He discovered chilling patterns that hinted at Victor's long history of manipulation and violence, always hidden beneath his polished public persona. But concrete evidence remained elusive. Victor was careful, calculated, leaving no clear traces. Finally, after nearly a year of digging, Simon stumbled upon a breakthrough. A former assistant of Victor's, a woman named Laura Mathis, had abruptly disappeared from Hollywood years ago, her departure shrouded in rumor. Through a string of contacts, Simon managed to track her down in a remote town in Oregon. She had changed her name and was living a quiet, secluded life, clearly haunted by something she'd left behind. At first, she refused to speak, her eyes full of fear. But Simon's persistence and the mention of Delilah's name wore down her defenses. One evening, as rain pelted the windows of her small cabin, Laura finally opened up. She revealed how Victor had once ensnared her in the same way he had Delilah, with promises, power, and charm that quickly spiraled into possessive control. She told Simon how she'd barely escaped, leaving everything behind to evade Victor's threats. But her most important revelation was a collection of letters, notes from Victor she had kept hidden, letters that revealed a side of him that no one had ever seen, a side that obsessed over control, that saw women as possessions. They contained hints of violence, veiled threats, and, more chillingly, vague admissions of mistakes that had to be corrected. These letters were the missing pieces, the evidence Simon had been searching for. Armed with this, Simon approached the police, who finally reopened Delilah's case. The letters, coupled with Simon's relentless findings, were enough to cast an even darker shadow over Victor's past, one that could no longer be ignored. But it wasn't just the police who took an interest. The media, hungry for a final verdict in the saga of Victor Devereaux, descended with a renewed frenzy. Victor, still in prison but ever the master of manipulation, relished the spotlight as he awaited a final decision on his fate. He claimed the letters were forgeries, that this was yet another attempt to tarnish his name. Ivy Lane, his lawyer, fought tooth and nail to discredit the evidence, pointing out gaps in the timeline and questioning Laura's credibility. But this time, there was no escaping the accumulating weight of proof. In a last, desperate attempt to save himself, Victor requested one final interview, hoping to sway public opinion one last time. News anchors scrambled for the chance, but he chose a renowned journalist, known for hard-hitting interviews. The night of the interview, millions tuned in to watch, captivated as Victor spun his usual narrative. He was a misunderstood genius, a tragic hero scapegoated by a society quick to vilify. He even spoke fondly of Delilah, feigning remorse for her death and decrying the witch hunt that followed. But then, the journalist, unrelenting, asked a question that froze Victor's charming smile. What would you say to those who claim that Delilah's death was not your first, nor your last attempt to correct a mistake? Victor's composure slipped for just a second, his face tightening. But that brief flicker of rage was enough, seen by millions, a chilling glimpse of the truth beneath his carefully crafted mask. His words stumbled, his charm faltered, and for the first time, Victor looked as monstrous as the whispers had always claimed him to be. That moment sealed his fate. Public opinion turned sharply against him, and the mounting evidence pushed the courts to declare Delilah's death a murder committed in cold blood. Victor was formally sentenced to life without parole. His fall was complete, and he vanished into the depths of the prison system, his name now synonymous with Hollywood's darkest scandals. Simon finally felt a measure of peace as justice was served. Yet, as he walked away from the courthouse for the last time, he couldn't shake the feeling that Victor's shadow still lingered. Hollywood had its stories, its stars, and its monsters. The industry would move on, as it always did. But for Simon, Delilah's memory was no longer tainted by rumors, no longer confined to a scandal. She was free from the grip of Victor's narrative. Victor Devereaux, the director who once shaped stories for the world to see, was now merely a forgotten name, lost in the cell of his own making.